positive intervention in areas of research, areas of information gathering, areas of dissemination, the procedures and methodologies, and what you have been planning to do for the next year?
A lot of interventions over the last 5-10 years in HIV prevention. This year the focus is really shifting to the question about men and men's behaviour. And it's, I think, although that we've had men's behaviour has been at the heart of the epidemic ever since it began, I think there's been a realization that unless we are serious about changing men's behaviour, then all our efforts to empower women, to try and make services available, are not going to be enough. So I think the important shift this year, reflected in the campaign, is to really give the whole issue about male behaviours and the way it underpins risk behaviours a much greater attention.
Will you tell us something about what research is and what methodology actually led you to this conclusion that men must be the...
Well, it's not so difficult to come to that conclusion in terms of the way this epidemic is being transmitted. Most of and certainly in the early stages of the epidemic, it is through contact with groups who have high levels of infection, and it's mainly men who are driving it. What I think the research has been showing in places like sub-Saharan Africa is that for the first time we're seeing extraordinarily high levels of infection in the community. Amongst women, for instance, there are countries where over 30% of women are infected. This is extraordinarily high figures. And those women are not having many sexual partners. They're monogamous, perhaps contrary to what sometimes is felt. So what is happening is that men are moving around in their work environment, possibly migrating. They're coming back and infecting women. So unless we address men's behavior, women are really in a very difficult situation to change their own position. Although we need to really keep on reinforcing their ability to discuss and to change the basis of their sexual relationships with their partners. But the crucial element is certainly going to be if we succeed in changing men's behavior. There's a lot of research now that suggests that this has been a neglected area. Basically, we don't really understand why it is that men are constructed in the way that they really are in terms of ideas of masculinity. And when you start looking at those sorts of issues, you start to go back in time in terms of the way young people are socialized, both boys and girls, and socialized quite early in the family, not necessarily by the father, but also by the mother. And the way that we are really preparing boys, young men, to behave in a way that will later put them at risk. So we're really, this emphasis on masculinity is one aspect of this year's program.
What are the specific areas and the method? Could you actually tell on the methodology for specific areas like the teenagers, like middle-class women, like the prostitutes, middle-class men, working-class men, at least a few of them, and the methodologies you have been taking in terms of literacy campaigns or...
Okay, basically we try and, in terms of reaching out to young people, which is a crucial part, again, of whether it's boys or girls, I think the main emphasis is on awareness about how to protect themselves and how to inform them about the choices that they're making. When you look at the statistics in terms of research, it's true that very few women or young girls really have the knowledge about HIV prevention. And that's true. The difference between rural and urban areas is a very important one. As you go further into the rural areas in a country like India, there's very little knowledge amongst young adolescents. So I think the crucial question there is how to really reach out to young people with the information they need. Secondly, is to do with services. Basically, in the area of sexual health, these are services that have tended to be neglected. STD clinics tend to be located in the worst part of town, around railway stations and rather unsalubrious conditions. It's the least attractive medical profession, even though it may be quite lucrative. So I think the whole area of services both for young people and particularly for women and men, is a crucial area of intervention. So I think that's the second real area. I think the third area, which is important across all of our work on HIV, is just to get much more discussion about sexuality, about the way this epidemic is being transmitted, because we're still faced with a tremendous reluctance to talk openly about these issues. And I think what HIV is doing is it really doesn't pay any attention to whether people are saying that they are not practicing high-risk behaviours. What it does do, though, it exploits the ignorance of people, and the virus enters into groups who otherwise will, may be thought to be relatively protected, but basically their behaviours are making them vulnerable to this virus.
Okay, you have been talking about a high-risk group and a group which is not practicing high-risk behaviour. When we have been talking about sexuality, you cannot but talk about gender, which you have been talking about when you said it may make a difference. But we have seen that the support system that is actually needed to support such a work and intervention, that is, people affected by AIDS are ostracized in a country like India, in the rural areas as well as in the urban areas. What kind of a support system do you think could be built up with the intellectuals, the college students, the university students, the professionals? Do you have such a plan to build a support system for the affected?
Okay, there are lots of very important questions included there. The first one I would take up is the question about high-risk groups and non-high-risk groups. What we would like to talk about is high-risk behaviours rather than high-risk groups or low-risk groups. Because if you start focusing on groups, then the tendency is to those people who are not included in that group tend to feel a little bit complacent, and they are not really at risk. The message of an HIV is that we're all at risk, whether we see ourselves as in a high-risk group or not. And we should really talk about behaviours, high-risk, low-risk behaviours. And that group that really practice low-risk behaviours may be much smaller than you or I think. So I think just in terms, that's an important point. The second point you made about was asking about what support is there for positive groups, those people who are infected. I think the most important thing for infected people is to be treated normally and to have access to the services that every other person in the community has access to. That in reality, is not happening now. People who are infected cannot get access to health services. They're sometimes excluded from schools if they happen to be young people. They're not given, we're seeing in places like Bangalore, Mumbai, positive people are themselves pulling out of employment rather than risk the public shame and stigma that is associated with HIV. So I think the important point for the most important support we can give to people who are positive is to break through the areas of discrimination and stigma. Now, in terms of practical support, I think that most positive individuals get most support from discussing with each other and getting mutual support. So the development of networks of positive groups is tremendously important. And we have to listen to their voice when we start talking about designing programs. So instead of us, as if you like, a society saying what is good for these people, I think we have to start listening to what they see as important. And probably their views will highlight the need for care and support, access to health services, access to schools. They're not asking for a lot, but they are asking to be treated on the same level as everybody else. So I think that in terms of support, we need to help them organize themselves. They may be a very diverse group of people, to put them in touch with each other and to give them the confidence to enter into society. And hopefully, I think that we found that those countries which have made the greatest impact on bringing down HIV infection have tackled the stigma issue very, very strongly. And in doing so, they have involved positive groups at the highest level, involving them in policy dialogue, involving them in any community initiative. I don't think we've got there here at the present stage yet in India, But we have to plan for it, and we have to get things ready.
One of the main questions that always arise with the word AIDS is morality. What would you say about it? How do you...
Well, I'd probably say very little about it, because I don't think the two are really very closely associated with each other. Morality is to do with values. This virus is to do with behaviours, and I think we're talking really about really focusing on changing behaviours. One can have one's own personal views about what should be an appropriate way of behaving in the community between men and women. That's a personal issue. But what we have to do is we have to stop the spread of a virus that is being communicated from one man to a woman to another man. That is a very physical process, and we're trying to, I think, to intervene in that transmission. Morality is often a way of avoiding the issue, and I think we have to be careful that we don't make our lives much harder by talking in terms of moral issues. What we have to, I think, talk about is behaviours, information, empowerment, and I think then we can start to get a grip on this epidemic. Each culture has to decide how it wants to approach these issues in a way that is suited to its cultural norms. What it cannot do, though, is to allow misinformation and myths to colour its response. So I think we have to, if we're talking about values, we have to emphasise a lot about facts and that are basically non-judgmental, neutral facts, and try and put them into the middle of the discussion so that people can base their decisions around factual evidence rather than a lot of attitudes and values that sometimes come in the way of an effective response.
But to do that, we need a support system and also a very good network.
Indeed we do.
What kind of support system is now working for, let's say, would work for the next 1 year or 5 years?
Here in India?
Here in India. And the organizations working with United Nations.
Okay, let me take first the grassroots organizations, the NGOs, the community-based organizations. I think they're growing, they're mobilizing. So they are one support system that is going to be very important. They're often not well linked up with each other, and I think we have a big task both to build their capacities and, if I may say, to bring more of the NGOs who are working on development into working on HIV. They haven't always felt that HIV was an issue for them. So in the NGO community level, we have to, I think, bring in more groups into this battle, because it's going to affect everybody later today or perhaps tomorrow. At the level of the government is trying to network knowledge across both within the country in terms of institutions, between state aid societies, and try and share best practice experiences. And then in terms of linking up different disciplines of technical resources which are needed for the program. So the government is trying to link up, have a support network. And from UNAIDS, we're trying to support the creation of that, bringing in, where possible, global knowledge as well into the national framework. Basically, though, at the moment, probably a lot of the knowledge is available in India, but it's not available where it is needed. And we have to find ways of accelerating the access of knowledge. There is plenty of knowledge about how to do things, how to protect individuals, how to launch projects. But we've still got large parts of India that have not yet put that into place. So I think it's a question of accelerating knowledge. The UN system is also actively supporting the national program in each of their areas of expertise. So we have, for instance, UNFPA working on issues that related to reproductive health, and particularly issues of women's empowerment, of using contraceptive methods maybe that women can use, like the female condom, or looking at issues that relate to the transmission of STDs, sexually transmitted disease. So UNFPA is working. UNESCO is very much interested, obviously, in the field of education, but also in culture and how culture influences transmission of HIV. UNICEF has a major mandate to look at the issues of mother-to-child transmission and working with young people. WHO, another technical agency, has a strong element in terms of surveillance and working on blood supplies. Today is, as you know, World Health Day, and the focus is on safe blood. That has tremendous importance for HIV transmission. So we're looking at areas where each agency has a strength and bringing that into the bear. The other area I think I would mention is issues of injecting drug, where UNDCP has a major contribution to make. So working with injecting drugs so that that does not become an epidemic that sparks other epidemics throughout the country. So injecting drug use is a very important sub-epidemic in which we have to worry about for the future. So each of the UN agencies, I haven't mentioned them all, but each one of them are trying to bring their expertise and their links with development partners to bear to support the national programme. UNDP, for instance, is working with NGOs and trying to really sort of link up with NGOs that are working at grassroots. UNIFEM is working with women's organisations and the whole issue of gender that you referred to earlier. ILO with its business partners and trade unions. So each of them has a partner that is potentially important for the epidemic.
You have been talking about the NGOs. Would you cite an example of an NGO who have been working in an area on STD HIV intervention project as an example, as a case study, which you think could be the model or following the model that UN wants to follow, which supports opposed to like this men make difference?
Okay, we're looking for good models. Perhaps the biggest model is the government's own national program around Family Health Awareness Weeks, where they're trying to really reach out to the community with knowledge about STDs and make it, and RTIs, and encourage women to come for services. Unfortunately, men in that experience have not tended to avail themselves of the services the government has provided. So I think we have an example that men really do need to be given attention. Other examples exist in many states. UNFPA is working in Rajasthan on trying to bring in STDs into the primary healthcare and reproductive health services. The most famous NGO or community-based organization that is working in a similar field is that in Sonagachi, in the red light area of Calcutta, where we see sex workers who have found that organizing themselves into a collective, but also addressing issues not just about HIV, but looking at issues of sometimes of police harassment or their rights to education, or trying to arrange for services for their children, like Balwadis. These are community processes that have proved that you can't treat HIV as separate from other community action and bringing about change in the wider environment. I think we shouldn't be seeing HIV as something separate from all these other processes that need to go on.
Now I will leave it to you. What other information would you like? Like one major thing is that how the media has been reacting towards this epidemic, how they have been highlighting these news, and
the media plays a tremendously important role, and I think on the whole it has been a very positive one. There have been times when the media has sensationalized HIV, and I think I think we're over that period. But there is always a tendency to fall back into the idea that a death from HIV hits the headlines, but a death maybe from tuberculosis, malaria, or even a child's death from diarrhea certainly doesn't hit the headlines. So I think we have to look at the way the press is in fact responding to the epidemic. What they can do, though, is to present it in a very much more scientific and factual basis. It's the press's duty to bring attention to not only the way the epidemic is moving, but how well the political organizations are responding, political society. I think the press has a tremendous role in holding the actors who are working on HIV accountable for what the effectiveness of the resources that are channeled through them. So a tremendously important role. The one area where I would like to see much more sensitive coverage is in relationship to HIV positive individuals, both on the mass media, television, but also on the press. Very often HIV positive people are named still. This time, 15 years after the epidemic, we find people's names are broadcast in the press, and so they lead to unfortunate consequences, really devastating consequences for those involved. So there needs to be a code of conduct around HIV that the media all follows, that respects the rights of positive people. But I think the potential in terms of informing people, informing families, informing communities, informing young people, the media potential is enormous. I think there's some still there is a reluctance to use the media to the full, and I think that some of the problems that as far as how much it costs to provide adverts, information, those countries which have been successful in tackling HIV have all used the media extraordinarily effectively. They have cut away restrictions on the advertisements of condoms. They have tried to address these issues as openly, as honestly as they can. I think we haven't yet learned that lesson in India. We're still in between. We allow a certain amount of information to go out, but we're not yet prepared to make an open discussion of the sorts of the scale that we really need to tackle this epidemic.
Since they have been talking about the trade union movement, to forming a trade union, the sex workers and wanting workers' rights. You have been talking about dealing with AIDS as not something separate, but linked with various other elements like their cooperatives, their health schemes, their cultural programs, movements. Don't you think that the Women's Commission of West Bengal, the School of Women's Studies and such other institutions, they have all been against the movement since 1997. How do you think that these people are to be, if not brought along with the movement, to side the movement or support the movement, at least some kind of a dialogue should be started? Have you, what will be the methodology of that procedure? At least to start a dialogue between these intellectuals who are the decision makers to some extent, and these people who have been fighting for their rights, fighting to stop the epidemic, fighting to stop trafficking, AIDS, use of teaching people how to about safe sex, condoms.
Right. I think here we have, in fact, two groups of people, excuse me, who are trying to achieve different things. One group sees an institution of prostitution as a center of exploitation and something that is going to lead to both to violence and to an unacceptable behavior both for women, and maybe it can be even degrading for men. So there's a very strong wish to